continuing with my grandmother. As I said, when I finally had the nerve to approach my grandmother and ask her some questions, I was in my 20s and already a mother myself. But she loved my husband. She was actually accepted him and liked him a lot sooner than my mother did, even though my mother played matchmaker. Because she liked him so much, she would actually allow him to talk to her, like come into her room and they'd chat. So one of these times I had told my husband I wanted to ask her some questions, so he was sitting in the room with her. I tried to get her to talk about the past, you know, her mother and things like that, and all she had told me was her mother had it so hard, and after she was the youngest, my grandmother, I'm sorry, she was the youngest of the 18 children, the last born. They were running around the streets and going wild because there was no one to watch them while she worked. So at that time, the state came in and they scooped up her and her brother, I guess being the youngest, and they threw them into an orphanage. And my grandmother said that was a horrible place. And it was the first time in my life I ever saw pain and fear in her eyes. And she said, it was horrible. I don't even want to remember a place like that. That's why I don't talk about the past. Who wants to remember horribleness like that? And I was like, oh, what happened? I don't want to talk about it. I don't even want to remember it. It was so bad, her and her brother, and I guess they were 5 to 7 years old or so, maybe a little older. They ran away. They actually escaped from the orphanage and ran away, but they caught them and brought them back. And they were there for about a year or two. And then finally, my grandmother was able to, I guess, get herself situated enough that the state would allow her to have her 2 youngest children back. I think her 2 youngest children. I'm not quite sure on that. I don't know which brother it was. Hard to keep track of. I mean, like I said, 9 made it to adulthood out of the 18, and I never met any of them because my grandmother was the black sheep of her family, and she didn't associate with the other relatives. The only time I met anybody was at the funeral of my great aunt, her sister, Viola, which was in the mid-70s, and I met a great uncle who actually liked my mother, and my mother remembered meeting him, and he was the only one again who defended my mother, being the daughter of a black sheep, against the other members of the family at the funeral, because they were starting to badmouth her, and they hadn't seen her in years. Funerals are extremely dramatic. They're as bad as weddings. But when I was having this conversation with my grandmother, I had gotten around to asking the question that had been on my mind for many years. I was trying to ask about her husbands, and she's like, and she was of the attitude, men yucky, bleh, sex, yeah. Sex was yucky. Why did you even have to have it? I'm like, obviously she didn't have, well, a gambler, alcoholic, and then another alcoholic, and whatever. I don't think the grandfather that I knew but didn't remember was an alcoholic, but most likely he may have been, but he wasn't obviously a bad one. I kind of threw it out there about, well, maybe it was yucky because, you really didn't, that wasn't, you have to understand how scared I was. I was scared that hand was going to come out like it did when I was 8. Bam! And she probably would have. I don't know, maybe. I thought she would have, even if I was in my 20s. She would have done it. I said, well, maybe, you just didn't like that sort of thing. And she was staring at me. Piercing stare. And I said, do you think, Grandma, trying to get my nerve up to say this, do you think maybe that's not what you were really interested in, was, men? She stared. She was silent for a bit, just staring hard at me, like looking through to my soul. And then she said, we didn't think that way back then. We didn't think at all about that kind of stuff. And her eyes said, and I'm not going to think about it now. And we're not going to continue this discussion. It ends here. And so I was like, okay, we'll just leave that there. And I kind of went, well, sorry to bother you, Grandma. Have a good, afternoon. We're going to go out and I'm going to make some food and whatever in the kitchen. And my husband was kind of like, He's like, I don't think we should do this line of questioning again. I'm like, no. But like I said, she still was my hero. She was feisty. She was brave. Even with the rheumatoid arthritis, she walked a mile or so to town every day, 7 days a week, with her little push shopping cart in front of her. Nothing maybe in front of it, in it, but she would walk to town, walk around the town, sitting on the benches to catch her breath. And she'd do that for a couple hours every day, just chatting with the locals, the local store owners and people that she knew. And this was her routine for the last, I would say, up until she moved from our home, my hometown. She did that for years in there. And I don't know if this is probably after she had to stop working. I don't quite remember why she had to stop working, but she had to stop working. Towards the end of my grandmother's life, she lived the last 2 years or so with my mother. One of those years was with me, and then I had to move and I couldn't bring everybody together, so they lived by themselves in a little cottage. This is all they could afford with their Social Security. And my mother was sickly, and so she was in the hospital for something. And I worked a few blocks away as an home health aide. So 5-6 days a week I'd be at the home, I'd be taking care of my patient. And my mother had a large, unruly dog. I had told my grandmother, I'll take the dogs out in the morning as I'm coming to work, and I'll bring them back in the afternoon. Don't you bring them back in. They're too rough and wild. They're going to pull you. You're going to fall down. You're going to hurt yourself. So she was 79 years old. My mother was in the hospital for like a month. I was coming back. We were a couple weeks into this, and I was coming back from work, and I got to the little cottage, and the dogs weren't outside. And I was like, she brought them back in. I told her not to do that. I got into the house, and I'm going, Grandma. And I looked, and my grandmother was in her bedroom, and she was lying in a weird way on the bed, like half up, not sitting all the way up. And she was always the type to sit all the way up, not just slouchy back. She was half slouched on the bed, kind of splayed on it. And I was like, Grandma, what the hell? And I said, you should have left the dogs outside. She's like, oh, they were barking and driving me crazy. I couldn't stand it. I had to bring them in. And I'm like, yeah, but you could have gotten hurt. She's like, they pulled me and I fell. Like, you fell? What the hell? You fell? Are you okay? She's like, I couldn't move. I couldn't get up. I dragged myself to the house. I crawled and dragged myself to the house and dragged myself on the bed. She's like, my back is hurting really bad. And I'm like, yeah, that's why I told you not to do that, not to screw with the stupid dogs, that they'd get hurt. And I'm like, are you all right? And she's like, it's hurting real bad. I'm like, I gotta call an ambulance. You could have, God knows what she could have done. And I said, we gotta call the ambulance. And she's like, oh, okay. And she didn't argue. So that must have been tremendous pain that she was in. This was one of the few times while we were waiting for the ambulance, we were actually talking. My mother had given me orders that if she should ever get sick and end up in a hospital and they put her on a machine, she said, don't let them keep me on the machine. That's not living, that's surviving, and I don't want that. And I was asking how things were. Like, they're okay. Except your mom. Well, what's going on with Mom? What's she doing? She's not feeding me very well. I'm like, well, what do you mean she's not feeding you well? She's giving me dog food. What? She's feeding you dog food? She's like, yeah, and I don't think some of the stuff she's giving me is, it's just not right. It's not cooked right, and I don't think she's caring. She's giving a shit. Oh my God. And I went to check, and I found, like, my mother didn't give wet food to dogs. She didn't believe in it. It was too expensive, but yet I found wet food in the cabinets. And I was horrified. And I was like, oh my God, oh my God, why the hell would she do that? I figured that out much later. It was revenge. But I'll go into that one later when I talk about my mother. And she's like, yeah, she's probably mad at me. She's like, but it's okay. I'm like, what do you mean it's okay? She's like, it's okay, I've had worse. It just hurts because it's my daughter doing it. I didn't know what to say after that. I was still stunned that behavior was going on. And it was actually the last time I ever saw my grandmother. She went into the hospital for her back. The powers that be determined that when my mother got to the hospital, she wasn't well enough to take care of my grandmother. I don't remember at this time what the problem was, and I couldn't at that time convince my landlord to allow me to take my grandmother in. I should have lied and took her in anyway. If I'd known that she was going to be passing away in September. They said she's going to have to go into a nursing home, and I said okay. I didn't have any choice, but I did remember having that conversation with her about her directives. And when she did actually pass away, I, being her caretaker, not caretaker, but you know, the one responsible for decisions, and she stopped breathing and lapsed into a coma. It was highly unlikely she was going to come out of it. About a day or two had gone by. They still didn't know what was wrong with her. I couldn't find anything out from the doctors. No one was calling me back, and I finally got a hold of her nurse, and I said, is there any, in your opinion, any way that she may come back to consciousness? And the nurse said it's highly unlikely. And I said, well, she has a directive that she gave me orders. She doesn't want to be on a machine, and she was on a respirator. And they took her off, and she passed gently into the night. About 6 hours later, she never regained consciousness. She just stopped breathing eventually, and didn't die from what they said she was going to die from, which is all you can ask for, to go kindly into the night. She was 6 weeks about short of her 80th birthday. She also told me one other thing. When she died, don't waste any money on her. Money's for the living, not the dead. So when I got the phone call the next morning after she passed away, and I got it from the funeral director that worked with the nursing home, because, you know, just easier that way. He said, you know, I'll help you in every way to make all the arrangements. And I said, well, she didn't want me spending any money. And he's like, well, you know, I said, and there isn't any money. She didn't have anything. And he was cool about it. And he's like, okay. He's like, well, you know, Social Security will pay for her funeral and everything. So me and my husband, I didn't bring my children because they were all little at the time, and I didn't want to have a conversation yet about death with them. So I got my landlord to watch them, or my next door neighbor, I don't remember. And it was just me and my husband and the funeral director. And he just had her coffin up on a thing, because there wasn't going to be any service or anything like that. It was just the coffin was up on something, so we could pay our last respects. I actually don't even think I looked at her. No, I didn't. I didn't even look inside the coffin. And we just said, you know, our prayers and whatever. And the funeral director made a point. He's like, you said not to spend that much money. And I said, no, don't spend. I don't have any money to give. And she had no money. And he's like, I want to show you something. And I said, okay. And he went over to the coffin, and he took his nail and he pushed it on the wood, and it indented into the wood. And I said, what? Styrofoam? He's like, yes. He's like, isn't that amazing? It looks just like wood, but it's like the cheapest thing. And it's inexpensive, and I think it was like styrofoam or something like that. He's like, it's inexpensive, and it breaks down properly, and whatever, and it's what you wanted. He's like, I hope that would make your grandmother happy. And I said, yes, it would make her very happy that no one spent any money other than the state on her funeral. And he's like, okay. And he seemed pleased that he pleased me. And that was it. We paid our respects, and she still doesn't have a headstone because I've not had the money for it. And I do remember her, again, her words of don't waste money on the dead. But next year, I'd like to get a tombstone, at least something beyond just a marker in the cemetery. I have the paperwork for the plot, so I know I figure we can figure out where she is and maybe spend the few $1,000s and get at least something, if only a grave pillow, to say her name and her birth date and her end date, so somebody knows she existed other than me, and now you. I want to thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you for listening to a little bit of my family history. See you soon. Bye.